This is post-punk. And this is post-punk. And this is post-punk too. So, what do all these bands have in common? Let's figure it out.
You're watching Lester Beer YouTube channel. Don't forget to watch this video till the end, and you can also follow me on Instagram and TikTok for more interesting stories about music. Let's start.
In 1978, Sex Pistols fell apart, right in the middle of their North American tour. The breakup was pretty much in the spirit of punk itself. Johnny Rotten and Sid Vicious were simply tired of each other, and honestly, by that point, punk rock had already burned through its energy. The genre that promised to blow up the old, moldy world of rock and rebuild it from scratch ran out of steam fast. Then, as always happens, major labels stepped in, grabbed the trend, and started cashing in on it. But almost at the same time, another movement was quietly forming, one that would fully explode at the turn of the 70s and 80s – post-punk. The term came from journalists. Later, people started using it not just for music, but for a whole cultural movement that brought together bands, labels, designers, and visual artists. Unlike punk, post-punk cut all ties with old-school 50s rock and roll. Punk bands like New York Dolls, The Stooges, and Sex Pistols still relied on classic rock and roll riffs. They just played them louder, faster, and dirtier. But their meaning was totally different. Punk grew out of late 60s social protest, political tension, and cultural revolution. Warhol, the Black Panthers, Thatcher's politics, everything fed into a movement built on nihilism, breaking traditions, and rejecting any kind of dogma. But a culture built on destruction can't stay that way forever. Punk eventually burned out. Bands didn't know how to move forward, and producers swooped in, signing the most successful groups like The Clash and Blondie, who then helped launch the new wave scene. Punk became part of pop culture, tangled up in the very commercial system it once tried to destroy.
Post-punk never set the same big and provocative goals that punk did.
Instead, it spoke directly to the hearts and minds of young people. In many ways, post-punk is a fully synthetic genre, built from different influences that came together at different moments. On one side, it became a new kind of musical poetry that focused on inner feelings and the individual. On the other, it turned into a playground for mixing styles and experimenting with sound. The early development of post-punk is pretty easy to trace. At first, it was basically a darker, moodier form of punk, heavier bass lines, more introspective lyrics, and themes that everyone could relate to. Loneliness, existential dread, death, fate. You can feel the influence of existentialist writers, sci-fi. Musically, the big push came from David Bowie's Berlin trilogy and German krautrock. Post-punk took its dark atmosphere from Bowie and his hypnotic, steady rhythm section from krautrock bands like Can and Noi. Jamaican dub also became a huge influence. You can hear it clearly in tracks like Joy Division's Auto-Suggestion, where the bass is heavy, static, and basically leads the entire song, very similar to dub. Around the same time in the US, the rising new wave scene got journalists talking about the impact of free jazz and even 20th century classical music on post-punk's more experimental edges. By the early 80s, the genre absorbed rhythms from funk and African music. Bands like ESG, Liquid Liquid, and Boots for Dancing brought a real groove and danceability into the post-punk space, making the music feel sharper and more physical. So, post-punk ended up combining punk's attitude and aesthetics with more complex structures, melodies, and production ideas. And over time, it influenced almost everything – new wave, synth-pop, early electronic dance music, you name it. That's not surprising. By the 1980s, post-punk had a truly global presence, with strong scenes in France, Germany, the Soviet Union, Japan, and across South America.
People were already talking about post-punk in 1977.
In November that year, journalist John Savage wrote an article for the British magazine Sounds, where he actually used the term post-punk, marking one of the first moments the label appeared in print. In the November 26, 1977 issue of Sounds magazine, journalists John Savage and Jane Suck published an important editorial about how punk was evolving into something more experimental. This article is often cited as one of the starting points for what we now call post-punk and even cold wave. The cover of that issue featured Kraftwerk's Ralph Hutter and Schneider, which perfectly matched the forward-looking ideas inside. In 1976, New York poetry magazine Contact published the earliest known use of the term post-punk in an interview with painter and poet Jack Michelin, but it was just a short mention.
The first post-punk band was ironically Public Image Limited, which was founded by John Lydon from Sex Pistols and Keith Levine, the founding member of The Clash.
Both punk legends wanted to play anti-rock, so they radically shifted from guitar-driven songs to chaotic sounds with strong experimentation and noise influences. Public Image Limited's debut album, 1978's Public Image first issue, was recorded in a chaotic rush after the band burned through their studio budget early. As a result, the album mixes polished tracks with rough, quickly assembled material. Musically, it blends post-punk aggression with dub-influenced experimentation. Most notably on Forage Stomp, built around a circle bass line and improvised vocals. The album also features sharp lyrical attacks and anti-establishment themes with songs like Public Image, Low Life, and Religion, taking aim at personal and institutional conflicts from Lydon's past. Their second album, Metal Box, from 1979, took the band's sound into darker, more innovative territory. Built on Ja Wobble's deep, hypnotic dub bass lines, Keith Levine's metallic guitar textures, and Lydon's bleak, stream of consciousness vocals, it became a defining work of early post-punk. Susie and the Banshees formed in London in 1976, started by vocalist Susie Sue and bassist Steven Severin. Even though they appeared right in the middle of the British punk explosion, the band quickly went in a completely different direction, developing their own darker, more experimental sound. Susie Sue and Steven Severin first met at a Roxy Music concert in 1975. In 1976, they became early followers of Sex Pistols, a connection that pushed them toward the emerging post-punk scene. Their early influences combined Bowie and Roxy music with experimental sounds of Can, Kraftwerk, and Neu, shaping a style that blended glamour, minimalism, and abrasive experimentation. The band's debut album, The Scream, from 1978, established them as major post-punk innovators. Critics described its sound as a unique fusion of the Velvet Underground's rawness with the experimental edge of Tagomaga-era Can. Their second album, Join Hands, from 1979, continued in a darker, more atmospheric direction, earning praise for its intensity and stark songwriting. Together, these early releases cemented Susie and the Banshees as pioneers of the post-punk movement. In his 1977 article New Music, The Cold Wave, John Savage wrote about the decay of punk and the rise of new European bands with a cold, electronic sound, such as Kraftwerk. This German band became a revolutionary force in both music engineering and aesthetic approach. Kraftwerk stripped away emotional expression in favor of almost modern architecture-like sharp shapes and static rhythms paired with simple minimalistic melodies. They were heavily inspired by Germany's 1920s retrofuturism and dressed like office workers while acting like robots on stage. Savage also wrote about emerging bands like Per Ubu, Throbbing Gristle, Devo, The Slits, and Wire.
Let's take a quick look at them. All of these bands are crucial to the rise of post-punk.
Per Ubu, formed in Ohio, represents a parallel American post-punk wave developing alongside the British one. They drew heavily from 1960s American counterculture bands such as the Velvet Underground and Silver Apples, which means there is no post-punk without both punk itself and experimental music at the border between rock and electronic sound. Per Ubu released 2 albums in 1978, The Modern Dance and Dubhausen. They shaped some punk aesthetics but managed to deconstruct them, adding a touch of musique concrète, a genre built using recorded sounds as raw material. And of course, Per Ubu carried traces of European cabaret culture. British industrial pioneers Throbbing Gristle are not a post-punk band, but their guitar noise experiments during early live sessions and their cold drum machine rhythms influence the entire genre, add their militaristic style and dark lyrics, and you see what I mean. Throbbing Gristle likely influenced Joy Division too, since Ian Curtis loved the endlessly depressing track Weepin' from the legendary album DOA, the third and final report, which used delay and reverb techniques that later became common in post-punk. Or take Hit by Rock from the same album. It's not punk, it's something tougher, heavier, and even if you want, senseless and mechanical. And these two features are crucial for the whole genre.
American post-punk act Diva built their concept around devolution, the idea that instead of progressing, humanity was actually regressing.
The band borrowed from Dadaism, the avant-garde art and literary movement that emerged in Zurich. Dadaism rejected traditional artistic and social conventions, embracing the absurd, irrational, and nonsensical to mock nationalism, materialism, and logic. Diva's music was primitive and mechanically parodic. Instead of advancing toward more sophisticated textures, they maximized the effect of repeating the same chords and rhythms. Albums like You Are Not Man, A Were a Diva from 1978 and Duty Now for the Future from 1979 responded to British punk with far less emotional delivery. This ironic, dystopian worldview became a major artistic trend in post-punk, inspiring bands to approach music through satire, critique, and absurdism rather than traditional rock rebellion. Diva treated synths, drum machines, and effects as equal to guitars at a time when this was still unusual in rock. Their visual style also became a blueprint for their post-punk aesthetic. The uniforms, plastic hair, and media culture parody pointed toward a new kind of art rock performance. Post-punk bands soon adopted similar approaches. As mentioned before, post-punk was heavily influenced by black and Jamaican music, dub in particular. The music of the Slits is a good example of incorporating dub rhythm into melancholic European music. British band Where's 1977 album Pink Flag came out at the peak of punk, but it had much in common with post-punk due to its minimalistic and jumpy guitar style and its dry, clipped sound. Just recall some modern bands like Dry Cleaning and you'll get the idea of who was inspired by them. Post-punk was born right at the moment when everyone was hyping the explosion of English punk, but the USA had already been home to early punk and proto-punk bands such as MC5 and the Stooges. By 1977, residents of the famous CBGB Club in New York Television released their legendary album Marquee Moon. Led by Tom Verlaine, the band invented a unique sound with strong influences from jazz, avant-garde music, and mid-20th century minimalism. It's hard to imagine Interpol without television, or the entire post-punk revival of the 2000s, which we'll be discussing later.
Art education, Thatcherism, and social issues like gentrification, urban decay, financial inequality all played a role in shaping the post-punk wave in 1970s UK.
Key figures who paved the way for the genre include David Bowie, Iggy Pop, and Brian Eno. Eno's experiments with art rock and ambient music, along with Iggy Pop and Bowie's Berlin period albums, especially The Idiot and Low, carried that cold, sophisticated European vibe. One event that helped shape the British post-punk scene was the Sex Pistols' performances on June 4th and July 20th, 1976 at Manchester's Leicester Free Trade Hall. Among the audience were future members of Joy Division, The Smiths, The Fall, Magazine, Buzzcocks, and Cult Factory Records co-founder Tony Wilson and producer Martin Hannett. That's how Manchester became the home of English post-punk. No other band is as closely linked to post-punk as Joy Division. Formed in 1976 by Ian Curtis, guitarist Bernard Sumner, bassist Peter Hook, and drummer Stephen Morris, they first recorded demos as Warsaw before changing their name to Joy Division. A reference to House of Dolls, a novel by Jewish author Yehiel Denur. In 1978, Joy Division signed to Factory Records and began working with producer Martin Hannett, who gradually shaped their unique sound using delay, reverb, and other studio effects. Hannett was influenced by German krautrock producer Conny Plank, who treated the studio as an instrument, a style partly shaped by his own struggles with drug addiction. This transformation turned Joy Division from a typical punk band into one with a gloomy, otherworldly sound. Their debut album Unknown Pleasures from 1979 marked the birth of the classic post-punk sound. Steady rhythms inspired by krautrock bands like Neu! And early Kraftwerk, simple but melodic bass lines by Hook, and haunting vocals from Curtis exploring inner worlds, depression, and modern world's alienation. The album's cover art, designed by Peter Saville, features a famous image of radio waves from Pulsar CP1919, becoming a true post-punk icon. Joy Division combined urban melancholy with something eternal, even cosmic.
I've been waiting for a guy to come and take me by the hand.
Their influences include krautrock band Can, the Velvet Underground, Captain Beefheart, David Bowie, and 1960s garage rock bands like The Monks and The Stooges. This brings us to another post-punk icon, The Fall. Formed in Prestwich, England in 1976 by Mark A. Smith, Martin Brama, Una Baines, and Tony Friel, The Fall pushed post-punk into sharper, more literary territory. Their mixed punk aggression with krautrock repetition, off-killer rhythms, and jagged guitars that felt both primitive and experimental. Smith's lyrics became a blueprint of post-punk writing, paranoid, surreal, bitterly funny, full of social criticism, working-class realism, and obscure cultural references.
Leeds was home to another influential post-punk band, Gang of Four, named after a Chinese Maoist faction.
The band initially consisted of vocalist John King, guitarist Andy Gill, drummer Hugo Burnham, and bassist Dave Allen. King's lyrics were influenced by situationism, philosophers Michel Foucault and Lacan, feminism, and Marx's theory of alienation, emphasizing the idea that personal is political. Andy Gill's sharp, nervous guitar playing evoked deconstructed funk paired with broken bass lines. Their 1979 album Entertainment is described as dance punk, art punk, and funk punk, influencing countless bands later on, including Red Hot Chili Peppers and Franz Ferdinand. Gang of Four also helped create what we now call dance rock. It was The Cure who bridged goth culture and post-punk. Formed in 1976 by guitarist and vocalist Robert Smith and drummer Lowell Tolhurst, their debut album Three Imaginary Boys was built on raw energy and teenage angst, sharing much with punk and power pop. This clean, wary sound stood apart from both punk and the darker goth aesthetic they later embraced, giving post-punk a template for using emptiness and simplicity as expressive tools. The album also introduced Robert Smith's emotional detached vocals, full of boredom, isolation, and surreal imagery.
Catch the dying sun, the nighttime follows.
Mark Stewart from Bristol wanted to play funk, but things quickly got out of hand. That's how the pop group was born. Though they only released 2 albums, their first LP, Why, paved the way for both new wave and the harsh experimental post-punk bands of the 80s. Think Frankie Goes to Hollywood alongside more abrasive acts. The band drew inspiration from Captain Beefheart, radical jazz artist Sun Ra, funkadelic, television, beat poetry, and existential philosophy. The pop group heavy, funk-based bass lines and sharp guitars became their signature sound. A certain ratio came close to them with their twisted Latin and funk rhythms. They were among the first to debut on Tony Wilson's Factory Records in 1979 with All Night Party, produced by Martin Hannett. Their sound echoed what emerging American bands were doing.
And that brings us back to the USA to talk about a major band, Talking Heads, true pioneers not only of American post-punk, but the 80s new wave as a whole.
David Byrne, Chris Frantz, and Tina Weymouth met at the Rhode Island School of Design, sharing interests in art, music, and culture. They moved to New York as the punk scene was rapidly growing. Their first gig was opening for the Ramones at CBGB. but they soon carved their own path, mixing funk, humorous lyrics, punk, and primitivism. Their first 3 albums form a clear arc that shaped how post-punk bands approach sound and songwriting. Talking Heads 77 introduced a nervous, angular rock built on clean guitars, jittery rhythms, and David Byrne's anxious, fragmented vocals. More songs about buildings and food from 1978, produced by Brian Eno, pushed the band toward sharper minimalism and experimental arrangements. Then, Fear of Music from 1979 went even darker and more paranoid. Songs like Life During Wartime and I Zimbra added tribal drums, dissonant riffs, and world music influences, hinting at the rhythmic experimentation that defined 80s post-punk and art rock. Basically, Talking Heads proved punk could evolve into intellectual, deeply experimental music, and that's what we call post-punk.
Yes. This is the girls. Starting life.
Post-punk is often associated with a particular formula: a static and simple bass line, echoing drums, reverb guitars, and tired, detached vocals. Where does this formula come from? We're entering the 1980s, and here is the answer.
It was Bauhaus from Northampton who made a huge step toward a darker post-punk. The group was founded in 1978 by Peter Murphy, Daniel Ash, Kevin Haskins, and David J. They took their name from the German art school Bauhaus, which influenced design and austere architecture. They debuted in 1979 with the single Bela Lugosi's Dead, which is now considered a gothic rock classic. It's remarkable that the band was inspired by reggae and dub, styles in which bass and drums play prominent roles. When they combined this with silent movie horror and goth aesthetics, they found their own unique sound. As bassist David J. mentioned, Bauhaus, like Joy Division, Devo, and the pop group, identifying themselves as part of the post-punk movement. At the same time, Peter Murphy was a huge fan of the Beatles and had also sung Catholic masses, which helped him develop his vocal approach. Other members found inspiration in reggae, beatnik prose, and German expressionism. Bauhaus' first LP, In the Flat Field, in 1980, marked a new era for the post-punk movement. The songs sounded heavy, leaning on distorted bass and reverb guitars. It was a pure renaissance of decadence. Killing Joke went for the same dark vibe on their self-titled 1980 album. The band formed in London in 1979 and quickly became a significant part of the post-punk and goth wave. The album was self-produced and was immediately praised by both listeners and music journalists. The songs sounded heavy, energetic, and swampy, paving the way for future grunge, alternative rock, and goth-oriented acts. The Cure's 1980 album 17 Seconds became the starting point for perhaps more than 70% or more of all later post-punk bands. Just listen to Play for Today or A Forest, and you will hear this legendary formula: repetitive drums, a simple bass line, and melodic guitar in the background, paired with blank, detached vocals. Joy Division's second and final album, Closer, also released in 1980, sounded like music from the future. The band almost completely moved away from melodies and traditional guitar work, building the LP on heavy rhythms, synthesizers, and studio production. It begins with the tribal drums of Atrocity Exhibition, continues with the ice-cold Passover, and reaches its depressive peak with the astonishing ballads Eternal and Decades. The album sounded like a goodbye, and it really was. Curtis took his life shortly before the release and became an immortal icon of post-punk. He wasn't as depressive in real life as later portrayed in films and internet folklore, but Curtis, in working-class clothes with a cold stare and nervous stage movements, soon became the living image of post-punk. We could also add Robert Smith of The Cure, Peter Murphy of Bauhaus, CSU, Tom Verlaine of Television, and David Byrne of Talking Heads to complete the list of genre legends. By By the early 1980s, post-punk had become monolithic and recognizable, with a strong bass presence and a dark, gothic atmosphere. Killing Joke, Bauhaus, Joy Division, and The Cure influenced dozens of bands across Europe and the United States. Just a few examples: French band Asylum Party, who recreated the same heavy vibe on their 1989 album, and German acts Grauzone and Geisterfahrer, who made post-punk even more minimalistic and heavy.
And now we move to the more artistic and romantic side of the genre.
The music of the 70s was driven by strong social and political awareness. Nearly every genre carried a protest message. Punk rebelled against the stagnation of prog rock and hippie ideas, while two-tone in England sought to break racial barriers. Post-punk questioned how to move beyond the blues-based rock tradition of the 60s. The result varied from raw minimalism to complex prog-leaning ideas, but the movement undeniably achieved musical internationalism. It spread across all social groups, educated youth, the middle class, and small provincial towns alike. A flourishing counterculture emerged partly due to state policies. Repression inspired protest, urban decay fueled dark artistic thought, and the limited option on major label catalogs led musicians to create their own record companies, sparking a boom in independent labels. Education in the UK and US was also more liberal than ever. After Circular 1065, British schools became accessible to all, and the government generously funded artistic experimentation. Suddenly, young people were studying free jazz, avant-garde art, and left-wing philosophy. In this environment, figures like Genesis P.O.R.H. and Throbbing Gristle could stage radical performances that made officials exclaim, "And we paid for this?" Margaret Thatcher's arrival shifted priorities, cutting support for schools that resisted the unified system. This helped shape the future conservative establishment of the 80s, an era whose problems inspired countless bands. Gang of Four shocked listeners with sharp political lyrics. Diva questioned established ideas in the US, while Bauhaus and Joy Division explored the inner world and existential dread. The 70s were the legacy of the baby boom generation. Young people grew disillusioned with their parents' consumerism, and literature, film, and mass culture started shaping their worldview more than anything else. Fans of post-punk often read Kafka, Sartre, and Camus, watched art house cinema, and embraced Gothic literature. Life became art, and art became part of everyday life. Such bands as the all-female Raincoats played a crucial role in promoting the artistic and sophisticated side of post-punk. Their 1979 debut album contained no fixed choruses and featured loose, unpolished vocal harmonies along with unusual rhythms and textures.
Post-punk has much in common with romanticism.
It also places a unique and vulnerable character at the center of the universe, and this feeling of egocentrism and individuality is absolutely essential for the genre. Take Echo and the Bunnymen's 1980 debut Crocodiles, with lyrics rooted in doubt, anguish, and despair, yet filled with euphoria and youthful protest. In the early 1980s, the press began talking about the new romantic wave. The Scottish band The Associates was often mentioned among them. Their music sounded like something between a major commercial act and a dark, gothic post-punk band, making wide use of synthesizers and rich studio arrangements. New romanticism laid the foundation for the 1980s synth-pop scene, with bands like The Human League, Soft Cell, and Depeche Mode. But it was the Smiths who remained the most romantic and heartbreaking band of the era. Formed in Manchester in 1982 by Morrissey, Johnny Marr, Andy Rourke, and Mike Joyce, the Smiths' non-rhythm and blues, whiter-than-white fusion of 1960s rock and post-punk was a repudiation of contemporary dance pop. The band avoided synthesizers and dance music. Their sound was built on melodic bass lines and Morrissey's emotionally rich, almost crying vocals. He sang about the misery of life, death, and loneliness. Morrissey's songwriting was influenced by bands such as the New York Dolls and the Cramps, as well as 1960s artists like Dusty Springfield and Sandy Shaw. The social realism of 1960s kitchen sink television dramas inspired him to write songs about ordinary city people and their daily struggles. Flowers and messy hair became their visual trademarks, and with their 1984 debut, they embodied the image of sophisticated and intellectual miserable youth of the 1980s, influencing everyone. Athens, Georgia, is the home of American neo-romanticism. It was the city where Bill Berry, Peter Buck, Mike Mills, and Michael Stipe met and formed r.e.m. Their 1983 album, Murmur, embraced rich bass lines and warm, dreamlike production that stood in sharp contrast to the mechanical rigidity of early post-punk. Michael Stipe's lyrics were cryptic, emotional, and deeply personal. r.e.m. created emotional space for small towns, private thoughts, memories, and quiet longing. This album is poetic, calm, romantic, and inward-looking. I also should mention such British bands as The Sound and The Chameleons as prominent groups that stood between post-punk and new wave. In my opinion, 1989's disintegration by The Cure became the peak of post-punk romanticism, with its huge, dramatic, heartbreaking, and tear-jerking sound. It was like the closing chapter for the whole 1980s post-punk.
And now it's time to talk about how post-punk shaped modern dance, electronic, and club sound.
When Ian Curtis died in 1980, it was the end of Joy Division and the beginning of New Order, the band formed by JD's former members who reinvented their style by adding dance vibes and the electronic sound of synthesizers. Their first 1991 album, Movement, followed Joy Division's patterns, was again produced by Martin Hannett, and disappointed the musicians because they didn't intend to sound that heavy and gloomy. Instead of parasitizing on past formulas, the group decided to move forward. In 1983, they returned with Blue Monday, a single that can be called the first electronic dance club hit in history. It was inspired by Eurodisco, synthpop, Kraftwerk, and was composed using a Moog source and an Oberheim DMX drum machine. Blue Monday opened a new chapter in music history, welcoming the rise of house and techno culture later in the 1980s. In the same decade, Peter Hook and Stephen Morris opened the Hacienda nightclub in Manchester, which became a home to the emerging European club culture.
How does it feel to treat me like you do?
Post-punk was deeply rooted in dance and rhythm-based music from the very beginning. I already mentioned the Slits as pioneers of incorporating dub into new European rock music.
In the USA, there was a whole scene of dance post-punk bands. All-female dance, punk, funk rock band ESG was formed in the South Bronx in 1978. They were also hired by Factory Records and Tony Wilson, who helped them record their first singles. ESG took inspiration from heavy James Brown tracks as well as from the New York punk scene. They sounded raw and wild. Conk was another act from New York where post-punk intersected with no-wave, Latin music, disco, funk, and hip-hop. Instead of rejecting dance rhythms like many rock bands, Conk embraced them. Their sound mixed sharp post-punk bass lines and guitars with congas, Latin percussion, polyrhythms, and deep groove. This approach directly influenced later indie dance and alternative funk bands such as LCD Sound System and The Rapture. Big Apple's dance punk group Liquid Liquid was active from 1980 to 1983. Their song Cavern went on to influence early hip-hop after the Sugar Hill Records used it as the backing track for rap classic White Line's Don't Do It. Bush Tetris were big in the Manhattan underground scene on the edge between the 70s and the 80s. Formed in 1979, they were part of the same downtown community as ESG, Liquid Liquid, Conk, and early Sonic Youth. But Bush Tetris leaned into a jagged, minimalistic sound. Their song, Too Many Creeps, became an anthem of early 1980s New York, capturing the frustration of urban life.
So, without these bands, there would be no modern club culture and indie rock revival of the 2000s.
There is not much to say about post-punk in the 1990s. Of course it existed, but it added almost nothing new to the genre. Take the American band Six Finger Satellite with their hardcore sound. Bands like Elastica had strong post-punk influences, but were still much closer to alternative rock, similar to Garbage. As for the cult bands, many continued releasing albums and changing their style. New Order turned toward dance music and more conventional rock, composing radio-friendly songs. Some groups such as Gang of Four, The Smiths and Bauhaus disbanded, opening the road for their successors and imitators, bands that had already begun appearing in the late 1980s. For example, the Dutch band The Essence sounded almost exactly like The Cure, even vocally, which is a little confusing. The most vivid example of post-punk's evolution is U2. They started at the same time as many other bands of this wave, borrowing heavily from Joy Division. But by the end of the 1980s, they were already global superstars with the Joshua Tree. This is how post-punk became something massive and mainstream.
At the beginning of the 2000s, this story came full circle. Bands from New York such as Interpol, The Strokes, The Rapture started playing music that resembled the late 1970s vibe.
Television, Talking Heads and Gang of Four heavily inspired their breakthrough, and this revival arrived right after the rock crisis of the 1990s and the rise of hip-hop. In Europe, post-punk always had local scenes spread across the continent. France and Germany provided the world with much of the formula for what we now call modern post-punk back in the 1980s. French bands such as Trisomie 21 and Cos Product combined post-punk with synth-pop and minimal wave aesthetics. In Germany, there were bands like Pink Turns Blue and Die Haut. Joachim Witt should also be mentioned as a key figure in the Neue Deutsche Welle, a local post-punk influenced movement that blended cabaret, Schlager, rock and synth-pop. Post-punk also existed on the other side of the Iron Curtain. In Yugoslavia, there was the gloomy band Dobre Isak, while in the USSR post-punk began emerging in the 1980s after Soviet listeners discovered The Cure and Joy Division. The most popular Soviet post-punk bands were Kino, Durnnoye Vlyanie, Zvuky Mu and Censure. They paved the way for the hugely popular Russian post-punk of the 2010s and 2020s. It all started with the early releases of Motorama from Rostov-on-Don in southern Russia and the Moscow-based act Manicure. Motorama released their first EP Horse in 2008, and their sound was shaped by the European post-punk traditions, mostly by Joy Division. Manicure uploaded their debut release to MySpace in 2009 and woke up the next day as internet stars. In the following years, post-punk began spreading across Russia and the post-Soviet region, popping up everywhere. Buirak, Peremotka, Ploho and dozens of other bands adopted a similar style, mixing romanticism with strict bass-driven arrangements. And finally, Belarusian band Molchat Duma achieved what nobody had managed before. They turned Russian-language post-punk into a global hit. It happened after the release of their 2018 album Etaji, when their songs blew up on TikTok and Instagram. Today, Molchat Duma play major festivals in Europe and in the United States, and you can even hear their tracks playing in Amoeba Music in Los Angeles.
This is how post-punk became something international and truly large-scale, uniting people across different languages and cultures.
Many things happened on the European and American scene at the end of the 2000s and in the first half of 2010s in terms of post-punk evolution. At some moments, it almost seemed like the genre could do it big again. I felt something like that when the British band White Lies released their first album To Lose My Life in 2009. They sounded like a pop reincarnation of Joy Division, which matched perfectly with the classic post-punk hype. The same can be said about Editors and their first two albums, starting with the brilliant 2005 debut The Backroom, the cover of which resembled Bauhaus aesthetic. But at the beginning of the 2010s, both White Lies and Editors dropped off the radar due to a creative crisis within the post-punk revival. You know, sometimes it's hard to succeed twice with the same product. Sadly, the same happened to another fantastic band from England, New Young Pony Club. Their first album, Fantastic Playroom, was fun electropop and disco rock with a strong late 70s feel. And their 2010's The Optimist, in my opinion, stands as one of the best post-punk revival releases of the decade. It's catchy, well-produced, deep and melodic.
You like your motor on. The world is in your way.
In the early 2000s, American indie rock transformed into something more melancholic and romantic. The drums from New York started with surf rock-inspired light summer songs and reached their dramatic peak on the 2011 album Portamento. Days, Money, these are such great post-punk songs that the band is already a modern classic.
I want to buy you something, but I don't have any money.
Beach Fossils from Brooklyn turned indie rock into lazy, minimalistic, modern post-punk on their 2010 debut, and New Jersey's Real Estate also has something in common with post-punk. We can find this influence almost everywhere in 2010's indie rock and dream pop. Take the debut album Idle Labor by Kraftspells, often described as New Order likes, or the second LP by The Pains of Being Pure at Heart, which is hard to imagine existing without The Cure. The beginning of the 2010s was also the moment when the European dark wave and post-punk scene rose again. I should mention bands such as Lebanon Hanover from the UK and Soviet from Italy. The first is famous for its cold, minimalistic, decaying sound, while the second made post-punk faster and more energetic than before. The American project Drab Majesty from Los Angeles is also crucial to the 2010s post-punk scene. Something happened to younger generations during that era that made many people turn to darker music. I think it has a lot to do with internet culture, social crisis, the cost of living, and changing technologies that make our world feel more dehumanized and sad. It's as if total internet depression brought post-punk back to life and made people want to live in brutal, crematorium-like buildings from Molchat Dema album covers.
Today we can find a local post-punk scene in almost every country, and bands like Fontaines DC still prove that post-punk can be played on big stages.
So, to make a long story short, post-punk appeared immediately after punk exploded at the end of the 1970s, and at some point it even existed alongside the biggest punk bands of the time, like Sex Pistols and Ramones, who released their debut albums. In the early 1980s, the dark post-punk canon took shape, along with the proto-electronic, dance-oriented side of the genre. Over the decade, post-punk absorbed elements of romanticism and gradually blended with the emerging new wave scene. In the early 2000s, the first wave of post-punk revival emerged, followed by a second wave in the early 2010s, and then again in the middle of the decade. Independent labels played a major role in the development of post-punk. Most releases of that era came out through these labels. Major labels often didn't want to sign strange, experimental bands with questionable reputation. But youth musicians were eager to move forward. Unable to secure contracts with big companies, they started their own ventures. The main post-punk labels were Factory Records, 4AD, Mute, Rough Trade, and Beggar's Banquet. Post-punk can be viewed from different perspectives. It became the link between punk and the new wave of the 1980s. It also laid the foundation for dance electronic music as well as modern indie rock, dream pop, and shoegaze. The genre influenced the form and aesthetics of rock music for decades to come. You can clearly hear its impact in the music of Coldplay, Kings of Leon, Arctic Monkeys, Warpaint, and Franz Ferdinand. By the mid-1980s, post-punk has lost its original freshness, but at the beginning of the 21st century it came back into vogue thanks to bands like Interpol and LCD Sound System. The genre has shown remarkable resilience. It is especially relevant in our decade, when art and the world as a whole is undergoing a huge crisis, and people keep looking back to the past for inspiration.
Thanks for watching this video, subscribe to my channel for more stories like this, and see you next time!